Thomas Gibbons-Neff on his new role as a gun culture reporter at the New York Times. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also a CNN contributor and the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up today if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America from a sober, serious perspective focused on reporting and analysis over hot air and opinion. So you can head over to thereload.com and sign up for our free weekly newsletter if you're interested in finding out more about that. This week on the show, we are going to be talking with, and I'm pretty excited for this episode, to be honest with you. This is something I've been talking about for quite a long time in our industry, in the journalism industry. But we're going to be talking with gun culture reporter from the New York Times, Thomas Gibbons-Neff, about his new gun beat. Welcome to the show, Thomas. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Excited to be here.
Yeah. Can you just start off by giving people a little bit more background on who you are for anyone who may not have heard of you before?
Yeah, sure. So I got into journalism around like 2014, 2015. I worked for the Washington Post and for the New York Times, covered the Pentagon, the U.S. military for a bit, and then I was a Afghan correspondent and the Kabul bureau chief for the New York Times. And after that, I covered the war in Ukraine on and off for 2 years, and just started this beat in recent months.
All right, wonderful. And, I'd be honest with you, we've been highlighting some of your work here at The Reload in recent weeks when we've seen some of these pieces you've been putting out, because I think they're quality pieces, and it's something a little different, I think, from the New York Times, at least in terms of approach and focus. And really not just the New York Times, but the journalism industry altogether. And major papers don't have gun beat reporters, something I've complained about for years. In fact, this Time magazine cover I was on in 2019 with lots of other people, they interviewed us for that. And that was one of my things I was talking about. I was like, I really would like to see the industry approach guns as more than just, mass shootings, which is where you get most of your coverage from major media outlets. And I mean, that feels like what maybe some of that is coming to fruition now. We're seeing some increased reporting of that, and your work is definitely part of that. Can you just why don't you just take us through a couple of the pieces you've done now that you've started this beat? Because you've got a couple out there that people can actually look at and judge for themselves, right?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I think the first thing I wrote was kind of an essay about my relationship with firearms. Before I became a journalist, before I went to college, I was in the Marine Corps for 4 years. I was an enlisted infantryman. I did 2 deployments to Afghanistan. And I grew up shooting before that. And I think, obviously deploying overseas, fighting in a war, and, I guess partaking in violence, you kind of, you I guess, see the other side of, the capabilities of of a firearm or a rifle when it's, not just shooting steel and paper. And, after that, going into journalism and then covering conflicts as a reporter, and then, being a non-combatant without having a rifle or any way to defend yourself other than your mobility, and then kind of seeing, watching from the side as people killed each other with firearms and, of course, bigger weapons. So yeah, that was kind of the first essay, and then I wrote about gun tubers, and I wrote recently about Rooftop Defense, the kind of the new American gun store. And I mean, the approach to the beat, I pitched it to the masthead, to the head shed, because I was coming out of Ukraine, and I think I was a little burnt out from covering stuff that I think had really, I think, put my head through the ringer.
Yeah, and difficult topics for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it was just a lot. Just kind of being like activated nonstop, and so, but I still wanted to contribute kind of the report, because I felt, one of the reasons I was covering, Ukraine and Afghanistan, I'd been in Afghanistan, B, I kind of knew my way around those situations in the sense of, being in danger and how to navigate that to an extent, along with my colleagues. And yeah, I still wanted to contribute to the report. So I thought maybe my background, I guess, really, I've got tattoos. I've owned a gun. I own a gun. So I thought, maybe this would help. And yeah, I mean, I'm just starting out on the beat, and my, I guess, general idea for approaching it is really, I think we were talking, before, just how many gun owners there are in America, and any way that you can humanize just a population that is so easily, othered or put at arm's length because, whether people are afraid of firearms or haven't grown up around them. And I think, a lot of that is New York Times subscriber base, who probably doesn't have as much experience with firearms as, good portions of the country. And
Sure.
And much like a foreign correspondent, like you want to write stories from these places that you might as well be like reporting on the moon. Southern Afghanistan is not a place many Americans have been to, but you're trying to tell a story and bring people there and let them kind of, experience that for the first time, but also kind of understand where, these, I guess, other cultures are coming from and experiencing themselves. So I thought, that would be a kind of a good baseline to start covering gun culture.
Yeah. Yeah. So you had obviously a background experience with firearms. You're knowledgeable about firearms, at least to a certain degree, right? Like you more so than probably most reporters, to be frank. And which makes sense that would set you up to be able to do a beat about firearms. And I think it is interesting, to especially talk about it at the New York Times, which has, an editorial stance that is for further gun restrictions, if not outright bans, oftentimes on, a lot of different kinds of firearms. And then, has a readership that leans left and favors more gun restrictions in large, generally speaking. And it's interesting to see, that analogy you used, I think, is a really good one in terms of like your average New York Times reader may not, or even editor or reporter may not have a very good grasp of why people own guns or feel the way that they do about firearms ownership in other parts of the country. Or, not that nobody owns guns in New York, but it's a less common thing there. And, it's interesting. So how did that conversation go with, your leadership at the Times? Like, why did they decide that this was something that would be valuable? Because, obviously, first of all, it's not the only thing you've been doing, right? You have some other pieces that you've written even when you've been on this beat. And it's not something that the Times has traditionally dedicated resources to in this way. So, what was it that maybe changed you convinced them, I guess, if you brought this to them, why do you think, what did they say that it was, okay, this is a good idea?
I mean, the national editor, Jillian Yang, she, said she'd been looking for someone to kind of fill that position, or, had wanted more storage or coverage on it. And I think, since being on the beat, the editors have been really encouraging as far as the kind of stories that I've pitched and kind of the room that I have to land them, no matter how much time that might take. Because I think a huge part, we talked about, New York Times kind of having that reputation, especially when you're trying to dive into different aspects of, American gun culture. There's a big hesitance. There's really no reason to talk to the New York Times if, you're Daniel Defense or BCM or whoever, because, they're afraid
a lot
of
of distrust among
a lot of distrust. And I think, when we talked about kind of writing a story for the subscriber base, I also want to write for, the gun owning community, who might learn something, or at least, take something else away from the stories that we end up writing. So it's not just kind of, it's educational for both sides. I think on the GunTube story, I think I saw some like forum where it was like, oh, the New York Times is just discovering GunTube, like 15 years later or something, which
Right.
yeah, I guess fair, but
we've ribbed you guys a little bit about that, to be honest, too. Like, hey, we did these stories 4 or 5 years ago, but I do it's still good to see you guys doing them in the way that you have done them, right? Because I think the approach is important, because like you said, there's a thought towards the audience that is the primary audience of the New York Times, but it's not like you're writing just for them to read, right? Like the New York Times is the most prominent newspaper in the entire world. And you're going to get a lot of audience that isn't just subscribers, and I feel like your work so far has done a good job of, finding real people, and then just kind of explaining their worldview to others in a way that's fair. That's how it's come across to me, at least. I've read the stories and I've thought, okay, this is, he went out and found people who are doing often interesting things. I mean, rooftop defense, that's an interesting story that, even a lot of your traditional gun owners might not know about. And certainly breaks a lot of the stereotypes that people have in their mind of what an American gun owner is. And it just tells the story of the owner of that store and some of the other people in that space. And which is, I think, what reporters should do, right? I mean, it's simple, but I don't know. That's what I feel like you're doing. Is that an apt description?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's right. Whenever you write a story, whether you're writing about, Ukraine or Afghanistan or any subject, like, it's up to the reporter and I guess the editors to an extent to kind of determine like what lens you're approaching the story from. It's like you always want to write objectively and, honestly. And I think with covering, especially guns in America, I mean, I think, I haven't written that many stories. I'm sure I will, stumble or mess some things up down the road. But I think, the idea is just really to, don't treat the audience like they're stupid. I mean, they know, the prevalence of, like the AR-15s are used in mass shootings. Like, we don't need to say that, every time we talk about this very popular firearm, right? It's like you don't need to hit the reader over the head with, kind of, I guess I would call them side quests or, speed bumps of throat clearing, because I'd much rather spend those words, because I have a limited space, on the actual story, on, so something you can kind of engage with. And of course, there'll definitely be stories where that is important, right? I've
Sure.
been focusing on the culture. I'm sure, in the future, there will be another mass shooting that I'll cover, and that'll be, violence and crime will be a big part of writing about firearms. That's just kind of how it goes. And I think that's hopefully what I bring to the table is kind of wanting to humanize, but also understanding on the backside, that what these things can be, what these tools, weapons, firearms can be used for, and what can kind of happen on the back end.
Sure. And, it's interesting to me because my approach to this has always been most reporters are good reporters. They don't want to misinform their audience. They don't want to mislead people. They don't want to propagandize to them. And the problem with firearms reporting, in my view, oftentimes stems from a lack of knowledge and understanding. And that really comes from, even much more so than, political bias. And that tends to stem from the fact that we just don't have a lot of beat reporters who focus on this issue. You can come from a paper that is even, openly left-leaning paper, much more so than the New York Times, like the Mother Jones or something like that. And you could still be a good firearms reporter if this is what you focus on as your job, right? The Guardian has done this over the years in the United States with several different beat reporters including Avonay Clayton is their latest one. But, just because you're reporting on it more often, you get a base level understanding of the issue that most reporters don't have. And to me, that's always been one of the major problems is the industry has just focused on this small sliver, the most sensational type of firearms violence, which is mass shootings, right? And understandably so, given how shocking they are, and how much people pay attention to them. But, that's obviously that's really even a small part of the story around criminal gun violence in the United States, right? And then violence is a very small story as part of the larger story of guns in America. Like there's so much more going on with guns than just how people use them for violence that just doesn't get any attention on any consistent basis. And so it's hard for a reporter who is probably doing general assignment stuff. They're doing all kinds of different stories. They're, a mile wide, an inch deep on all kinds of stuff. And that's a town of its own to some degree, but oftentimes they're just coming in to write about firearms when a mass shooting happens. They don't have any sort of special, they don't really have the tools, the knowledge necessary to do it properly. And it leads to a lot of basic mistakes that destroys reader trust. I don't know. And so, even if I have no idea what your beliefs are outside of what I've read from your piece on firearms and the politics of it or anything like that. And maybe we would disagree personally on those things, but I would have more trust in the reporting that you're going to do on this because it's something you're going to focus on a lot more and have a better understanding of than your average reporter. And I don't know, I've kind of gone off into a little bit of a monologue here just because it's something I've been talking about forever. And it's interesting to see a major paper finally do something like this. But I don't know. What is your view of, I guess, media approach to firearms, especially major media outlets up to this point? Like, do you think that I would imagine the answer is yes, because you're doing Gun Beat now. But is that when you see the failings or the mistakes made in major media pieces on guns, where do you think the problem flows from? Because my opinion, I guess, is it flows from a lack of knowledge and a lack of focus on this topic.
Yeah, I think listening to what you're saying, and I kind of said this in that essay I wrote a few months ago, but it really comes down to resources, right? I think that Times has wanted or been open to covering kind of this part of it, or my beat specifically, but right, the other stuff, crime, legal action, what have you, mass shootings, that takes up a lot of the bandwidth. So I feel very fortunate to kind of be at an institution where, I have that leeway to really kind of focus on what I'm focusing on. And I think, if I don't know, if there's like that, but I'm thinking back to the Washington Post when I worked there and covered the Orlando shooting in San Bernardino, right, where it's the pace of the news, and if the police are wrong and you amplify what the police are saying, and it turns out right, like what the Orlando shooter used an MCX, right, which I think is a piston gun, and right. Not gas impingement like an AR-15, and that just kind of turned into this whole thing with getting angry emails from readers, because we wanted to like generalize and demonize the AR-15 when it wasn't the AR-15, but pretty, you could argue for days like the MCX is an AR-15 style platform. And I think even today, the language has changed so much where AR-15 style, went from like AR-15 to AR-15 style, has kind of moved along with, that response, because that was, I think in the past years, it was an easy way to lose trust, or at least authority.
Yeah.
And
how much, I guess, on that front, how much do you put into making sure you get terminology correct? Because I will say, like, there are, certainly if you get very basic, there's very basic terms that if you get them wrong, you're going to lose trust and you're going to deserve to lose trust. Like if you don't understand the difference between semi-automatic and fully automatic, something as simple like that, or if you make very common mistake that magazine versus clip, right? There's some of these things that where it's pretty clear cut that you're just wrong, and it's a signal that you don't know what you're talking about, right? But there's a lot of other things where it's kind of there's a open debate. For instance, silencer, right? Silencer, that is the technically the statute term that the federal government uses, the ATF uses. It's what the inventor called them. His company was called Silencer Co., Hiram Piercy Maxim. The most popular company today is called Silencer Co. That still makes them. And but at the same time, most people don't like that term in the gun world because it's misleading, right? The silencers don't actually silence firearm shots. They reduce their sound. So most people call them sound suppressors. And that can be something that you get in fights over. It's similar with what you're talking about with AR-15 applying to an MCX, which is MCX is technically not an AR-15. It is AR-15 style is sort of there. You get into there's a lot of mealy mouth terms, right? Like assault weapon style, just tossing style into the end of something. People tend to do that. And yeah, I don't know if that fixes things, but I'm just interested in your, like, how when you go to write a story and there's going to be some technical terms in there and you have to, like, I use silencer in reporting. I might put in, hey, there might be some caveat in the written piece that says, oh, they don't really silence guns, or they're more accurately called suppressors, but I'll use silencer because most people understand it's not really technically wrong. I don't know, what's your approach to it?
Yeah, I mean, to me, having covered the military and now in this field, I think terminology is extremely important because that is the first place you can get written off as like a serious reporter on a subject. So I think that, I mean, really being spot on with that. I think in the rooftop defense story, I said silencer or suppressor, right? I got both because the ATF is called, like you said. Yeah. The legal term silencer, but it is a suppressor. It doesn't silence firearms. I mean, I think it's like you want to get the absolutely right to a point. I mean, you have limited space, so you can't spend 50 or 300 words trying to get into the nuance.
But it is something that you recognize the importance of making sure that you're getting at least the very basic stuff right, and even maybe as you said with the silencer suppressor, you might even put in both terms just to show that you understand them, I guess.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think talking about in the rooftop defense story, Saul selling 40 millimeter grenade launchers, right? It's, there's the barrel and the receiver. Those are two separate things, and how they attach to the rifle, whether it's the barrel or the handguard, just shorten it to they attach to the rifle. Like, I'm not even going to go down that road, right. For that reason. And
it is too. You brought up like another reason I think reporters overlooked. Like, one, you want to have credibility with your audience, but also you can avoid repeating false information, right? Like, for instance, the United Healthcare assassination. Right, the police came out and they were saying, "Oh, it's this Wellrod replica, this B&T."
There was like one New York Times detective who didn't even know what or not New York Times, excuse me, like NYPD, yeah. Yeah, NYPD detective who kind of didn't know what the firearm was, but just like speculated and just said it. Just went wild from there.
And this was something that I, at CNN, and I've been lucky with CNN. I think they've been very good to me, and they've come to me for whenever they have sort of technical questions like this, and we can do really good segments where I'm explaining various points. And this was one of them where it's like, okay, the police said this thing, and a lot of reporters' instincts is just, well, the police said it, so it must, they must know something, or they must have good reason to say that. That's not always the case, right? And there's a very strong assumption, I think, in media across the board that if somebody in law enforcement says something about a gun, or somebody who's former military says something about a gun, they must know what they're talking about because firearms are associated with law enforcement and the military. And certainly for good reason, but that can get you into a lot of trouble because it's not always true. Not every law enforcement officer or military veteran or even generals or what have you know that much about firearms. Like they're not all experts on firearms. And so this was a good example of that, where some NYPD guy speculated, and I understand why he did, given the silhouette of the gun when you saw it on the video. But one thing you could see from the video is that it was a semi-automatic firearm. And those well rods and the replicas, the modern replicas, they are not semi-automatic. And so it could not have been that gun. And this was something I had to like vehemently explain to Sam. Do not repeat this, or like let me go on and explain why it can't be what he's talking about and why it has to be some kind of semi. And that, it turned out to be right when they recovered the firearm. But it is an example of like where even beyond just serving your audience, that's a service to your audience, right? To not just take whatever an official says at face value, because they may be wrong. And if you can show that they're not correct using evidence, you should do that. But it's just an example of why being knowledgeable on the topic matters, right?
Yeah, and I think that, again, like the most public and high profile events where, whether it's the well rod or 3D printed Glock 19, that's what everyone's looking at. So if you misstep in those initial hours or days, right, you could write a million spot on stories about the same topic. But since the well rod thing was, it was hovered over mainstream media coverage throughout the entire news cycle.
Yeah, and I saw people made fun of reporters for repeating that. In gun spaces, I saw a lot of that because it's like, well, it obviously wasn't this thing because it couldn't have been physically, and that's what and that's something that helps keep your credibility. But speaking of which, obviously, I'm talking about being on CNN. You're a New York Times reporter. There's a clear, as you mentioned earlier, distrust of major media among gun owners, gun businesses. How do you approach winning their trust to do stories on them? Like, how has that gone so far? How do you show someone that you're not there to try and screw them over? Because that's a common concern that you'll run into, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think I'm still trying to figure that out, right? It's being upfront with what you're trying to cover. I mean, I think my background certainly has helped. And I have a few stories under my belt that I could show, whether it's that essay or the gun tube story or, rooftop defense, just kind of this idea of, hey, this is my approach. Take a look if this fits or it doesn't. But again, I think that only goes so far because, right, you look at people in the gun space, gun companies, like having the New York Times attached to your name is like a negative effect, right? Like it shows like, well, oh, you're talking to the New York Times, like you must be, behind their editorial stance in some way, shape, or form, or something like that. So I think that it has a wall or a ceiling. But I think at the same time, most people, I think, are, in the case of Saul from Rooftop Defense, he just thought it was his, place to speak up for his community, for representing gun owners in the way that he did. And I think there is that push and pull, and when it comes down to it, and trying to find the people who kind of have that mantra, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. And then on the other side, I mean, I assume you get pushback the other way from readers or from people who would expect the New York Times to, cover the story in a different way than you've done. How do you try to minimize that? Like when you get critical feedback that you weren't tough enough on somebody in the gun industry or what have you, how do you?
I think that's definitely going to be expected. And I think at the end of the day, it comes down to just education, right? I mean, that might be something that a commenter feels about, or that's how I, get an email and it's structured in a way that you're always going to miss something with limited space. You try to get everything you can into a story, and it's almost never, you always want more words or more time. So at the end of the day, I just hope for New York Times subscribers are the people who are not are coming from the non-gun owning or non-gun aware community, that they empathize a little more or learn a little more about a culture they don't have a lot of experience with.
Absolutely. And when we started this conversation, you described yourself as like a gun culture reporter. Can you just like give me a little more insight into how you view what your beat is? Because gun culture is just, it's fairly expansive term, right? You could cover a lot of things in there. And your last piece dealt with gun business as part of a cultural, through a cultural frame. And frankly, I thought you did a pretty good job of like actually having an understanding of the gun business, how gun companies actually, how the industry works, and that like guns themselves are not very profitable. Most of these dealers are making money off of accessories, or interestingly, you got into kind of the drop culture, sort of similar to shoes, and collectibles, and stuff. But when you go and think of what am I going to cover this week or next week on my gun beat, what are the types of stories that you're looking for?
Yeah, I think like guns are just another vehicle to talk about like tons of aspects of American culture, right? Whether it's like the first day of deer season in some places, meaning it's like the day of school off, right? And how like deer season can shape a community, or a gun factory can influence how a town grows around it, or cloners and how cloning rifles from the GWAT is another way to connect with history. It can really be like anything in a sense. And I think right now, as I stumble around trying to figure out what stories I'm doing, it's really just throwing spaghetti at a wall and seeing what sticks and who wants to talk, and trying to build it out in a way where I get to go see the thing and do the thing and learn about these different communities that have formed around firearms in the United States, and then write about it the best I can. The last thing I want to do is parachute in or not give everything the amount of time that I want to write like a story you can like take something away from. And I think as far as like, we've talked about it, I think on the phone before, right? The political side, the legislative side. I think that's certainly in my realm. I'm definitely a little more scared of that, because I think that takes just a lot of knowledge to really write authoritatively on. And I think right now I'm kind of, again, trying to introduce New York Times readers, general audience, to these parts of the country they just really have no experience with. So,
yeah, because realistically, guns touch pretty much everything in American life to one degree or another. Like you could cover it from a business perspective, you could cover it from a political perspective, you could cover it from a sports perspective, right? There's a lot of shooting sports that have become increasingly popular in recent decades. You could cover it from a cultural. There's a lot of broad cultural approach to how you look at guns. There's a lot of cultural stories. So, it's really not a one man beat, right? But that's more than what most places will give it. Right. It's interesting you really could go out and write kind of any story you wanted from that touches any part of American society, right? It could be a tariff story, right? You need American gun manufacturers are largely, the gun industry is largely kept most of its manufacturing in the country, at least for the American brands. There are a lot of imports from other countries as well, but even those manufacturers are going to need to get steel and their base products from somewhere. And this could have you could look at it from a tariff. You could fit into the tariff story that's going on right now. There's all kinds of things, right, that you could approach with this. So it's interesting just to think about how broad the beat really is. But yeah, I mean, I think it's been fun to read some of the stuff that you've produced so far. As like you're talking about there, just kind of introducing some of these different characters that exist in the gun world to readers who probably wouldn't know that they were out there in the first place, right? Do you have I mean, I don't know if you want to give away any of your stories you're working on right now, but do you have like general topics that you're pursuing next? You've done gun tubers, you've done, some of these, I would say non-traditional gun businesses is kind of the last one, rooftop defense, but also A Better Way 2A was in there. I've been on their podcast before. They're interesting dudes. What do you have a sort of maybe just a general theme for your next piece or next one, something you're working on right now?
Yeah, I think I kind of hit on it, but definitely like I think the cloning community is really interesting for a lot of reasons. And 3D printed the 3D. We haven't really talked much about it, but 3D printed guns, right,
Mm-hmm.
and how that's kind of seen as the next iteration of gun culture in the United States, and is just a big component of whatever's next. So I think there's always room to write about that in a way that kind of gets away. Of course, ghost guns is a term thrown around, but just kind of gets under the hood of that in a more humanizing way.
Yeah, the 3D printed gun community is definitely an interesting one. There's especially since it seems to tend to be pretty different from your traditional gun owning community, in similar ways to how your last story explored some of those some of the businesses that cater to non-traditional gun owners, but also just like they tend to be more socially liberal and much more libertarian. I mean, if you're out there printing your own guns, you probably tend to be more libertarian in your political views than your average deer hunter or something like that. Not that there is an overlap, of course, but people are complex. But there's definitely a very fascinating community, and there's even a lot of infighting that goes on in there for what really is a pretty small, close knit community too. But a lot of fertile ground for stories, I would think, in there. And so, I mean, what's been the reception inside the paper so far? I mean, have you gotten any pushback for the kind of work you've been doing, or has it been, because I would assume a lot of the people who work there also might find some of what you're doing illuminating too.
Yeah, I mean, it's been great. I mean, it's been encouraged and well received. It's funny, right? Because we talked about like the forum saying, "Oh, the New York Times just discovered GunTube 15 years later," or whatever. And then for a lot of, well, not a lot, a few of the my colleagues, right? It was a whole different planet, right? GunTube, like they'd never heard of it before, never experienced it, didn't know it existed, right? So it's. Yeah, I guess that's proof of purchase of why doing a GunTube story in 2025 is okay, right? Like there's people who can learn about it.
And that's a good point too about the forum reaction, or someone like myself, like, oh, I did this story 5 years ago or whatever, or I'd known about GunTube since 2005, or that's great, but most people don't know these stories. Most people have not still think of the old white guy hunter from, the out in rural area as your picture of a gun owner, when that's really not that those people don't exist, obviously, but or their stories aren't important, but that's not everything, right? That may not even really be the median face of a gun owner anymore in America, and most people don't get that. I think there's still a lot of stories to be told that haven't been told, and there's a lot of people that even if someone's written a story similar in the past, it didn't reach a lot, necessarily the readership of the New York Times, right, or the audience of CNN, right? There's value in that as well. Yeah,
I mean, I think really over the years, like the silos of coverage, and it's a lot of crowds talking at each other, not really bridging between the two. So,
yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, hey, if people want to, first of all, I appreciate you coming on and talking with us and just giving your perspective and get a better understanding of what the Times is doing here and some of your background and how you're approaching this. But if people want to follow this, right, your reporting, what's the best way that they can do that?
Yeah, definitely subscribe to the New York Times. That would be that'd be a good place. Not super active on social media. I should probably change that. I think I'm on Blue Sky, but I don't really know how that works. Even though, I mean, it's a lot like Twitter, but I don't really understand the list thing. But yeah, I think subscribing is probably the best.
So they can, if they Google your name, I think that your New York Times author page will come up, right?
Right. Definitely.
I think that's the best way if they want to track your individual stories, that's probably the best way to do it, right?
Yeah, definitely.
That's how I usually do it.
That's how I usually do it when I send stuff to my mom.
Or you'll publish a piece and it'll get some, people will be talking about it. In fact, I think Open Source Defense is a really good Substack out there. They had a piece on you, well, at least on your beat in the New York Times recently that said, I think the New York Times is the best new gun publication out there, right?
Yeah, that was something. And I think they had like a screen or not a print, but a graphic. And it was I think a Glock 19 with a New York Times logo on the slide, which was
those guys always have really good graphics. They always have something interesting to say. So I'm not the only one who's noticed your work in this space. And I think other people, if they give you a chance and read what you're writing, will probably appreciate it as well. So they should go do that.
Yeah, hopefully. Right. And hopefully I can, keep them on the level.
There you go. All right. Well, look forward to reading more from you in the future. Appreciate you being on. That's all we've got for this week. I'm going to hand it off to myself to talk about another very high quality publication, the Dispatch. We're doing our ad swap. So I'm going to hand it off to me. All right, folks, it's time to talk a little bit about the Dispatch, doing an ad swap here between the Reload and the Dispatch. And I think that's fitting because if you like what you're getting from the Reload in terms of high quality reporting that focuses on hard news, you'll probably like the Dispatch as well, because get this, they also focus on high quality reporting and hard news. Now, they are a much broader publication than the Reload. We obviously focus on one specific area, whereas the Dispatch has a much larger team and is able to focus on a whole number of other issues, but still primarily in that national politics realm like we do here at the Reload. But they are one of my favorite publications. I am a paying member to the Dispatch. And so clearly, I highly recommend it. I've been a paying member since they were founded, and I've never had reason to rethink that even once. So they are constantly breaking news stories. They are sending you newsletters on whatever frequency you want. They have quite a variety of them over there. But I subscribe, for instance, to the Morning Dispatch, and I get, I think, a very nice summary of what's really going on from a pretty sober perspective. That newsletter is hard news and it's focused on it. And I think it's fantastic, but they also, of course, have some of the best commentators, in my personal opinion, over there as well. It was an outlet founded by Steve Hayes and Jonah Goldberg, two guys I've known for a long time. They've been on the Reloads podcast. Kevin Williamson as well has been on our podcast. So you've heard from these guys if you've been a Reload listener for a while here. And, I think you should check out the Dispatch if you haven't already. We have a free trial as well, 30-day free trial for Reload listeners if you want to go over and check out their paid offering, which I think is well worth the money. So I'd encourage you to do that. There's a link in the description of this podcast or on our website if you want to check it out. So head over to the Reload to get that link, or head over to the Dispatch to see what they're all about.